Every wealthy widow in 3 territories tried to claim him. Every one of them failed. Then a poor woodcarver with calloused hands and nothing to offer handed him a piece of carved wood, and the entire frontier lost its mind. They called her a schemer. They called him a fool. They burned his land to prove their point. What they didn't count on was that the woman they underestimated had already decided she wasn't going anywhere. This is the story of Gideon Hart and Alara Finch, and the winter that changed Red Hollow forever. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. The widow Castellan arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Gideon Hart decided he was done being polite about it. He saw her carriage from the ridge while he was fixing a section of fence that had buckled under 3 weeks of ice. The vehicle was too fine for Red Hollow's roads. Black lacquered wood, brass fittings that caught the pale winter light, a pair of matched grays that probably cost more than most families in this valley earned in a year. He watched it rock and lurch through the frozen ruts of the main road below and felt something in his chest tighten. Not excitement, not even mild curiosity, just the flat, tired feeling that came with knowing exactly how the next 2 days were going to go. He drove the last fence post in with more force than necessary and climbed back down toward the ranch. His foreman, a compact and weathered man named Dutch Seaver, was waiting by the barn with a look that mixed amusement with genuine sympathy. Dutch was 53 years old and had been working this land since before Gideon bought it. He had seen most everything. "Castellan?" Gideon asked. "Castellan," Dutch confirmed. "Brought 3 trunks this time. Her housekeeper says she intends to stay through the weekend." Gideon pulled off one glove and pressed his cold fingers against his forehead. "She stayed through the weekend last time." "That she did. And I told her then that I wasn't interested." "That you did." Dutch paused. "She also brought a surveyor's map. Her man showed me when they were unloading. Looks like she's offering the property east of the Sullen Creek parcel. 80 acres, clean title, no liens." Gideon looked at him. Dutch held his hands up. "I'm just reporting. Tell Martha to prepare the small guest room, 1 night. And tell whoever handles the widow's luggage that 3 trunks don't fit in the small guest room." He walked past Dutch toward the house, already exhausted by a conversation that hadn't happened yet. Miriam Castellan was not an unpleasant woman. That was part of what made it so difficult. She was 41, handsome in a deliberate way that came with wealth and effort, and she had inherited 600 acres and a profitable timber concern when her husband died 4 years ago. She was smart enough to have run both successfully and social enough to have done it without making enemies. In a different life, in a different arrangement, Gideon might have found her agreeable company, but she sat across from him at his own dinner table that evening, wearing a gown that cost more than his best horse, and the way she looked at his dining room, the exposed beam ceiling, the iron candle holders, the unpolished pine floor, told him everything. She was cataloging, running estimates, calculating what the place could be if someone with taste and money took it in hand. "I've made some improvements to the east parcel since we last spoke," she said, cutting her meat with the particular precision of someone who had grown up being watched at table. "Cleared the elm stand near the creek. It opens the sight lines considerably. You could run a second herd there easily if you had the—" "Miriam," he kept his voice level. "We've had this conversation." She looked up. Her expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. "We've spoken about the land, yes. I thought perhaps your thinking had—" "It hasn't." He set down his fork. "The land is generous. You've been generous. That's not the issue." "Then what is the issue, Gideon?" And there it was. The slight edge that slipped through when the patience wore thin. Not anger exactly, more like genuine frustration from a woman who wasn't accustomed to being told no and couldn't find the logic in it. "You're 38 years old. You run a good ranch and you've built something real here. But this valley doesn't have to be as hard as you make it. You could have—" "A partner," he said flatly. "Yes. You mean a wife." She held his gaze. "Those aren't always different things. They are when the partnership gets offered before the conversation does." He picked his fork back up. "I appreciate the visit. I'll have Dutch arrange your carriage for tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was uncomfortable enough that even the fire in the hearth seemed to think twice about crackling. But she left before breakfast. Dutch found Gideon in the stable at 6 in the morning, running a brush down the flank of the gray mare he'd bought the previous spring. The horse was still half wild and didn't entirely trust the process, but she tolerated it. "Castellan's gone," Dutch said. "I know. Left the surveyor's map," Gideon kept brushing. "Put it with the others." Dutch leaned against the stall post. "You've got a collection now. 4 maps, 2 deeds of promise, a letter of credit from the Harwick family bank, and 1 live chicken that Bessie Trout left back in September when she was trying a different approach." "The chicken's still here?" "Living in the East Coop, laying regular. I named her Proposal." Gideon stopped brushing. He looked at Dutch. Then, despite himself, he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was the closest thing to one he'd managed in a while. "Fine. Keep the chicken." "Already have been." Dutch straightened up. "You know Castellan will talk when she gets back to Harwick County. She'll talk anyway. They all do. This time she'll be annoyed about it. That's different." Gideon went back to the mare. "Let her be annoyed." He wasn't trying to be cruel. He just couldn't figure out a way to explain, without sounding like either a fool or a romantic, that none of it, not the land, not the money, not the social advantage, not even the very reasonable companionship, felt like anything other than a transaction wearing a dress. Every woman who had come through his door in the past 3 years had arrived with a ledger already balanced. He was a line item. A favorable one, he supposed, but a line item nonetheless. He'd been married once, briefly, to a woman named Claire who had died of fever in the 2nd year of their life together. He didn't talk about that. He barely thought about it in the daylight hours. But whatever it had felt like, the actual specific texture of it, 2 people choosing each other without arithmetic, he hadn't found it again. He wasn't sure Red Hollow contained it. The blizzard came in the 3rd week of November. It moved down from the northern range without much warning, the way bad weather often did in this part of the territory. A drop in temperature, a shift in the wind, and then overnight a white wall that sealed the valley off from the rest of the world. By the 2nd morning, the snow was past the bottom rail of the porch fence. By the 3rd, the road into town was impassable. Gideon had supplies, livestock secured, and enough hands staying in the bunkhouse to manage. He'd weathered worse. What he hadn't accounted for was riding the perimeter fence on the 4th day and coming across the Finch property. He almost didn't know what he was looking at. The small house sat at the far western edge of the valley, where the land flattened out before rising again toward the tree line. A poor location in winter because it caught the full force of northerly winds with nothing to break them. The structure was sound enough, but barely. One window was boarded over with planking that had gaps in it. The snow was drifted nearly to the eaves on the windward side. There was a woodpile by the door, or what had been a woodpile. Most of it was buried, and what showed above the snow was wet and dark. He sat his horse for a moment, breath fogging in the cold. He knew the family only in passing. Walter Finch, who had worked a small carpentry trade until a tree fell wrong 2 autumns ago and crushed his leg badly enough to keep him off it for most of a year since. There was a daughter. He'd seen her in town. Quiet, didn't talk much, usually carrying something heavy. He couldn't have told you much more than that. He turned his horse toward the house. He had to knock twice before the door opened, and when it did, the young woman who opened it clearly wasn't expecting company. She was wearing a heavy wool coat over what looked like 2 shirts, her dark hair pinned back imperfectly, her face wind-raw from cold that had clearly been getting inside. She looked at him the way people looked at strangers when they were in trouble and hadn't decided yet whether to admit it. "Miss Finch," he said. She recognized him. He saw it. The slight recalibration in her expression, the awareness of who was standing on her step. It wasn't awe, exactly. More like wariness. "Mr. Hart," her voice was steady, points to her for that. "Your woodpile's buried." She glanced toward it, then back at him. "I'm aware." "Your window's not holding." "Also aware?" He looked at her for a moment. She was heavy-set, solidly built, the kind of person who looked like they'd been doing physical work most of their life. Her hands on the doorframe were wide and calloused, and there was a faint smell of cedar sawdust coming from inside. Wood carving, he remembered someone mentioning once, though he couldn't recall where. "I've got split cord in my west barn," he said. "More than I'll use this season. I can bring a load over." Something crossed her face. Not quite pride. not quite discomfort. A combination of both. "That's not necessary," she said. "There's a man in there with a bad leg," he said. "It'll be necessary by tomorrow if this weather holds." She held his eyes. Hers were dark brown, steady, and gave away considerably less than he expected. "Why?" He blinked. "Why what? Why would you bring wood over? You don't know us." It was a reasonable question, and he found, uncomfortably, that he didn't have a smooth answer to it. "Because your woodpile's buried and mine isn't," he finally said. "And it's a bad storm." She looked at him for another few seconds. Then she stepped back from the door. "My father would want to thank you himself. Come in if you want to wait while I get him." He waited. He didn't come in. The house was small and cold, and it felt like an intrusion. But he waited. He made 3 trips that afternoon, his 2 largest ranch hands helping him haul and stack cordwood against the side of the Finch house, where the drift wasn't bad. He also sent one of his men back with spare caulking and an hour of work on the boarded window, which they got sealed properly before the temperature dropped again toward evening. He didn't speak much to the daughter during any of it. She helped move wood without being asked, working steadily alongside his men, not talking except when she needed to. Her father sat in the doorway for a while, unable to do much with the leg, but clearly wanting to see what was happening to his own property. He was a thin man with a gaunt, dignified face and the hands of someone who had spent his life making things. "You didn't have to do this," Walter Finch said when the work was mostly done. "It's a bad storm," Gideon said again. He was aware it was becoming a refrain, but it was the truest thing he had. All the same, the old man looked at him with quiet directness. "You have a good heart for someone they say has no heart to give." Gideon didn't know what to do with that, so he nodded once and left. He didn't think much more about it. The blizzard eased by the 6th day and the valley dug itself out slowly, the way it always did after bad weather. One road at a time, one property at a time, everyone checking on the nearest neighbor and calculating losses. Gideon lost 2 calves to the cold and a section of the north fence to the drifting weight of snow, which was less than he'd feared. He was doing accounts in the main house 10 days after the storm when Dutch came in and set something on the desk. It was a small carved piece of wood, maybe 5 inches long. A horse, not stylized, not decorative in any precious way, just a horse, caught mid-stride, rendered with enough care that you could see the tension in the haunches, the angle of the neck. Underneath it, whittled into the base, G, heart, red hollow, November 1886. Gideon picked it up. "One of the Finch girls' hands dropped it off," Dutch said. "No message with it." He turned it over. The work was quiet but exact, not the kind of thing you made in an afternoon. Someone had spent real time on it. He could see small, careful cuts at the main line where the tool had been reworked, the slight asymmetry of the legs that made it look like something alive rather than something ornamental. There was no show in it. It hadn't been designed to impress. It had been designed to look like a horse. He set it on the edge of his desk where the light from the window caught it. "Did she make it herself?" he asked. "That's what her father does," Dutch said. "Carpentry and carving. Looks like the girl learned the trade." Gideon looked at the carved horse for a long moment. He had, sitting in a locked box in the bedroom, more expensive gifts than he could count from more women than he cared to remember. Silver flasks, a pocket watch with his initials, a saddle with hand-tooled leather from a widow in Cresswell who had paid a craftsman 3 weeks' wage to make it. Not one of them had looked at him from across the room the way the small wooden horse did. But he told himself he was going to return it. It felt wrong to keep it, too much like accepting something he hadn't properly earned. But every time he picked it up to put it away, he set it back down again. 2 weeks later, he rode into town for supplies. He saw Alara Finch outside the general store. She was loading flour sacks into a small cart, alone, her father not with her, doing the kind of lifting that should have had help but clearly didn't. She was wearing the same heavy coat from the storm, and her boots were wrapped with leather strips on the left one, which meant the sole had probably separated. He pulled up and tied his horse at the post. "Miss Finch." She straightened and looked at him without particular surprise, which he found he appreciated. "Mr. Hart." "I kept the horse," he said. He wasn't sure why he led with that, but there it was. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, more like a small, quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't much, she said. It was the most honest thing anyone's given me in 3 years. He hadn't intended to say that either. He seemed to be conducting himself unusually today. She looked at him steadily. She had that quality, he was noticing, a kind of stillness that wasn't passivity. It was more like someone who had learned to hold their ground without motion. "That's a low bar," she said, "if that's your 3 years. He made a sound that was more laugh than he expected. "Fair." She finished loading the flour sack, straightened again, and looked at the cart with the brief calculation of someone who needed to get somewhere and was measuring what it would take. Her horse, a small brown animal that had seen better days, was hitched to the post 20 feet away. "Let me help with that," he said. "I manage." "I'm sure you do." He walked over and lifted the last 2 sacks before she could object. "Doesn't mean there's a reason to do it alone." She watched him with an expression that suggested she was deciding whether to be irritated about this. "You do know you're not obligated." "You know, you say that a lot." She paused. "I say it because people in this town tend to assume obligations that aren't there, usually because they want something back." He put the flour in the cart and turned to face her. "What would I want from you, Miss Finch?" She considered him. The wind moved through the main street and lifted a strand of dark hair across her face. She pushed it back with her wrist because her hands were dirty. It was a small gesture, entirely practical, completely unperformed. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He nodded. "Reasonable position." "Thank you, I think." He untied his horse and put his boot in the stirrup. "My name's Gideon," he said. "Since we've already been through a blizzard together." She looked up at him from beside her cart. "Alara," she said. It sounded like she made the decision to offer it about half a second before she did. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse toward the feed merchants. He went back to town the following Saturday, and the one after that. He told Dutch it was supply runs. Dutch said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The truth was that he found himself seeking out the parts of Saturday that contained Alara Finch, the hour when she was usually at the market, or outside the carpentry shop her father still operated from the house's side room, or occasionally sitting on the bench outside the post office, working on something small with her hands while she waited. He didn't seek her out in a way that was obvious or pressuring. He didn't announce himself, but he moved through the town's routines differently now, aware of where she was in the way you became aware of a change in the weather. They talked slowly. That was the only way to describe it. Cautiously, carefully, like two people who had both made the mistake of moving too fast toward things that looked good and weren't, and had learned something from it. She told him about her father's leg, which was improving but would never be right. She told him she'd been carving since she was 12, that her father had taught her on scraps from the shop, that she sold pieces now at the market. Small animals mostly, practical things, tools handles when someone needed them, and that it earned enough to cover food when the season was decent, and not quite enough when it wasn't. She didn't dress it up. She didn't apologize for it either. He told her about the ranch, the practical parts, the things that worked and the things that were harder than he'd expected when he bought the property. He told her about the fence damage from the storm. He didn't tell her about Claire. That was different. That took time he hadn't gotten to yet. What he did tell her, one afternoon when they were both leaning against the fence post outside the feed store for no particular reason, except that neither of them had started walking yet. "The widows who come. I know what you've probably heard." She looked at the street. "I've heard things. Most of them true, in terms of the facts. I've turned down a lot of offers." He paused. "I don't turn them down because I'm difficult." "Why then?" He thought about it. "Because there's a version of my life where I'm a very good deal for someone. Profitable land, established property, no serious debts, and I've had women come through my house who wanted that version of my life and were willing to spend time around the man attached to it." He stopped. "I'm not a deal." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "you're not." Then, "That must be lonely, though, having so much and not being able to trust any of it." He looked at her. She was looking at the street still, her expression thoughtful rather than sympathetic, like she was working something out rather than offering comfort. He found he preferred that. "Yes," he said. That's exactly what it is. By December, people had started to notice. It wasn't dramatic at first. A few raised eyebrows at the feed store. A comment at the barber's that Dutch repeated to Gideon with careful neutrality. The way conversation in the mercantile seemed to pause and then resume at a different pitch when Gideon walked in and exchanged a few words with Alara at the counter. Red Hollow was not a large town. It had the social economy of all small places. Everyone's business was semi-public, and the business of prominent people was entirely public. Gideon Hart spending his Saturday afternoons in visible proximity to a poor woodcarver's daughter was, in the arithmetic of the town's gossip, a spectacle. Miriam Castellan, he learned through Dutch, had told two women in Harwick County that Gideon's judgment had softened. The Tully sisters, who ran the millinery and monitored the town's social registers with the dedication of professional archivists, had been seen discussing something quietly while watching Alara at the market. Alara knew. He could tell she knew, from the way her shoulders sat differently in town now, a slight readiness in them, a brace against something invisible. But she didn't change her routes or her routine, and she didn't bring it up, and he respected that enough not to push. What she did do, one Tuesday evening when he had stayed longer than usual, helping her move a large section of burled wood her father needed shifted in the workshop, was stop in the doorway after the work was done and say, "You understand this is going to get worse." He looked at her. "Probably." "They think I'm after your money." She said it flatly, not with hurt, just as a statement of existing conditions. The widows especially, but also the merchants who do business with you. Anyone who had plans that included you and didn't include me. She paused. "I need to know if that's going to change anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you after my money?" he asked. She looked at him like the question was almost insulting. "I'm after nothing. I carved you a horse because you brought wood in a blizzard. That's where this started." "I know that." "So why are you asking?" "Because," he said, "I wanted to hear you say it. Not for my benefit. For yours. You said it clearly and without embarrassment, and that's—" He paused. "That's not nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on and walked out into the cold evening, and the wooden horse was on his desk at home, and he hadn't moved it since the day Dutch set it down. Christmas came and went. January was brutal. Gideon started finding reasons to check on the Finch property that weren't entirely pretextual but weren't entirely necessary either. He brought over extra lamp oil once because they were short. He sent one of his hands to fix a section of roof that Alara had mentioned was sitting wrong, watching her face carefully when he told her, reading whether it landed as charity or as something else. She accepted it the same way she accepted most things from him. Directly, without performance, with a quiet and considered thank you that felt earned because it didn't come automatically. Walter Finch, for his part, watched all of it from his chair by the workshop window, with an expression that contained everything old fathers feel when someone they trust is looking carefully at someone they love. He didn't say much, but one afternoon he called Gideon in from the yard on a pretext, a carving technique he claimed to need a second opinion on, which was clearly false since his work required no opinions. And while Gideon stood looking at the half-finished piece on the workbench, Walter said, "She's had a hard few years." "Yes," Gideon said. "She doesn't talk about it much." "I noticed. That's not a weakness. She's just—" Walter turned the carving tool over in his hands. "She got used to carrying things alone. She doesn't know yet how to put things down." Gideon looked at the old man. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. Walter nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "She deserves someone who can wait." The afternoon, he finally said it plainly, was in February, a Thursday, in the cold midday light outside the carpentry shop. He had come to help her load a commission, 8 carved fence post caps for a property 2 miles east, someone who'd paid actual money for decorative work, which was a small good thing. They had loaded the cart, and she was checking the straps, and he was standing there, having been standing there for about 30 seconds longer than the task required. "Alara," he said. She looked up. "I want to be honest with you about something." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I'm not here because of obligation. I'm not here because I feel sorry for your situation or because I'm trying to do some kind of, he stopped, some kind of good deed with a face on it. I'm here because talking to you is the only part of most weeks that doesn't feel like work. He paused. And I don't know what you want to do with that, but I thought you should hear it plainly. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold put color in her face, and her breath came in small, visible clouds, and she had sawdust on her coat collar again, which was almost always the case. I've been thinking about it, she said carefully. About what this is. What it could be. She looked down at the cart strap, then back up. I'm not easy. I don't mean difficult. I mean I've got a father who needs care and a business that barely runs, and I'm not… She paused. I'm not what people expected you to land on. I know that. And you're not bothered by it. I'm bothered by about 40% of it, he said honestly, but not the parts you think. She looked at him steadily. Then, for the first time since the day he knocked on her door in the blizzard, she let something through her expression that wasn't careful. Something open and a little uncertain and entirely real. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene. It was two people acknowledging something that had been accumulating for weeks without announcement. He helped her with the fence post caps, and she drove the cart east, and he rode back toward the ranch in the gray February afternoon. And the valley was cold and the roads were mud, and something in his chest had shifted into a position it hadn't occupied in a very long time. He didn't name it yet, but it was there. March came in sideways, all wind and gray sky and mud that sucked at boot heels and wagon wheels alike. The valley was still ugly from winter. Brown grass, fences knocked crooked, the creek running high and brown with snow melt. Red Hollow itself looked like a town that had survived something and hadn't decided yet whether to be grateful about it. Gideon noticed the shift in the third week of the month, on a Saturday when he and Alara were walking back from the market with nothing in particular driving the pace. They passed the millinery, and through the glass he could see the Tully sisters, Clara and Mabel, both somewhere north of 50, both possessed of opinions they treated as civic obligations, watching from behind a display of hat ribbons with the particular stillness of people pretending not to watch. Alara didn't look at the window, but she'd seen them. He knew she'd seen them because her stride didn't change, and neither did her expression, and that deliberate lack of reaction was its own kind of answer. How long has it been like this? He asked. Since January, properly, she said. Before that, it was just curious. Now it's something else. What kind of something else? She thought about it. The kind where people have already decided what's happening, and they're just waiting for the part where they get to say they were right. He looked ahead down the road. Right about what? About me. She said it without particular bitterness, just as a fact laid flat. The story going around is that I've been working you, that I set up the situation with the blizzard, which makes no sense when you say it out loud, but logic doesn't really figure into it, and that the carving was calculated, that everything since has been calculated. She paused. That I knew what I was doing when I handed you a piece of wood. Did you? She glanced at him sideways. I knew I was saying thank you. That's the sum of it. He nodded. I know that. The Tully sisters don't know that. Miriam Castellan definitely doesn't know that. And Harlan Briggs at the bank told my father last week that he hoped Walter wasn't encouraging anything that could end badly for the family. She said the last part in a tone that was flat and controlled in the way things got when they were actually anything but. Gideon stopped walking. Briggs said that to your father. To his face. While my father was there about a different matter entirely. What did Walter say? Something shifted in her expression, a mix of pride and grief that she covered quickly. He said he appreciated the concern. Then he came home and sat in the workshop for 2 hours, making very small, very precise cuts in a piece of oak that didn't need to be cut at all. She started walking again. He's a quiet man. That's how he handles things. Gideon fell back into step beside her. He was quiet for a moment, working through the particular anger that came not from being attacked directly, but from watching the people around you take the hit on your behalf. It was a worse kind of anger, harder to do anything useful with. I'm going to talk to Briggs, he said. Don't. Her voice was firm. That makes it a bigger story. Right now it's gossip. If you walk into his bank and defend me, it becomes a conflict that travels further. So I do nothing. You do what you've been doing, she said, which is act like a person with ordinary judgment who made an ordinary choice. The more normal you behave, the less material they have. He looked at her. That's a very measured response to someone insulting your father. I've had practice. She shifted the basket on her arm. We've been the wrong kind of people in this town for a while, Gideon. My father's leg took his work and the money went with it, and people don't forget that kind of slide. They assign it meaning. She stopped at the corner where their roads diverged. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying I know how it works. He held her gaze. There were things he wanted to say. About Briggs, about the Tully sisters, about Miriam Castellan, and the particular cruelty of wealthy women who felt they'd been passed over. He held most of it. All right, he said finally. Your way. She nodded. For now. And she turned and walked toward home with the basket and the deliberate stride of someone who was not going to look back, which meant he was left standing at the corner with the unsatisfying sensation of being reasonable when he didn't want to be. The land syndicate arrived in April. There were 3 of them, and they came in from the Eastern Road in a hired coach with a company name, Harwick Valley Development Concern, stenciled on the door in gilt letters. The man who did the talking was named Aldous Reeve. He was 47, wore suits that hadn't been bought in this territory, and had the specific manner of someone who had spent a long career being the most sophisticated person in whatever room he walked into and had started to depend on that. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon without announcement, which Gideon noted. Fine property, Reeve said, standing on the porch and surveying the valley with the professional appreciation of a man calculating acreage. Better positioned than most in this stretch. Access to 2 water sources, good road to the Eastern Pass. You've managed it well. Thank you, Gideon said. He had not offered coffee. Reeve smiled at the omission and didn't comment on it. I'll be direct, he said, which was how people began sentences when they intended to be the opposite. The concern is looking to consolidate ranching operations in this valley. Several properties. We're paying above assessed value, 15% above, in some cases 20%. Clean title transfer, 60 days to vacate. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. We're prepared to offer you $7,000 for the Hart property, including the water rights. Gideon looked at the document without taking it. $7,000 was a serious number. He was aware of that. It was enough to start over somewhere larger, somewhere with better rail access and more developed land markets. The offer wasn't insane. What do you intend to do with the valley? Gideon asked. Reeve's expression adjusted very slightly. Consolidated cattle operation, more efficient at scale. Better market outcomes for the whole region, ultimately. For the whole region, that's correct? And the families that currently work smaller spreads in this valley, the ones that don't sell to you. A brief pause. The market will reach its own equilibrium. Right, Gideon said. He took the document from Reeve's hand, looked at it for about 3 seconds, and handed it back. No. Reeve didn't move. Mr. Hart, I'd encourage you to... I heard you the first time. Gideon opened his front door. I appreciate the visit. Dutch heard the whole thing from the barn and reported it to the 2 senior hands with the editorializing efficiency of a man who had very clear feelings about people who said equilibrium while describing the destruction of their neighbors' livelihoods. What Dutch didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Reeve had already visited 11 other properties in the valley before Gideon's. 7 had signed. 3 were still considering. Gideon was the holdout that mattered, because his land sat across the primary water access, and without it, the consolidation couldn't work as planned. Gideon learned this a week later from Cal Mercer, who ran a mid-sized spread 2 miles south and came over on a Sunday with the tight-shouldered look of a man carrying bad news. 7 signed, Cal said, sitting across the kitchen table with his hat in his hands. Briggs at the bank advised 4 of them to do it, told them the offer wouldn't hold and that if they waited, they'd get less. He turned the hat in his hands. I don't know if that's true. It's not, Gideon said. They need the valley consolidated. Individual holdouts are exactly what they don't want. He set down his coffee. Who's still out? You, me, the Hooper brothers, and Elias Prentice. 5 operations total. Cal paused. Prentice is close to signing. His wife's been sick and the medical cost. He shook his head. Can't blame him. Gideon thought for a moment. What if the holdouts operated collectively for the season, pooled access to equipment and water management, made the combined operation too stable to look like easy pickings? Cal considered it. That's a year-long commitment minimum. Yes. And if Prentice signs anyway? Then it's 4 instead of 5. We work with what we have. But Cal put his hat on and stood up. I'll talk to the Hoopers, he said. But Gideon, he stopped at the door. Reeves' been talking around town. He's been talking about you specifically, about why you're refusing. A pause. He's been suggesting it's not entirely a business decision. Gideon looked at him steadily. Meaning what? Meaning your name and Alara Finch's name are in the same sentence when he tells it. The version going around is that you've let a woman with no stake in this valley talk you into bad financial decisions. The silence in the kitchen was complete for about 4 seconds. Is that the version? Gideon said quietly. That's the version. Cal opened the door. I thought you should hear it from someone who doesn't believe it. Alara heard it from a different direction. One of the women at the market, Ruth Halloway, who was not unkind but was not strong in the presence of the Tully sisters, pulled her aside on a Thursday and told her, with the uncomfortable sincerity of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have, that there was a story circulating, that Alara had been counseling Gideon against the syndicate's offer, that she was doing so because she stood to gain from his continued presence in the valley, a suggestion that covered in a single rumor both her motives and her character. I'm sorry, Ruth said. I thought you should know. Thank you, Alara said. She finished her shopping and drove home and sat with her father in the workshop for an hour while he worked, and she didn't, which was unusual enough that he eventually set down the chisel and looked at her. Tell me, Walter said. She told him. Not all of it, but the shape of it. He listened without interrupting. Then he picked the chisel back up and made 2 careful cuts and said, Are you going to let it change anything? No, she said. Good. He turned the piece over in his hands. You know the thing about wood. You cut with the grain when you can, but sometimes the piece doesn't give you a choice, and you cut against it, and it's harder and it takes longer and the surface isn't as clean. He ran his thumb along the cut. But it's still a good piece at the end. She looked at her father. He was a man who said important things sideways and expected you to follow. She had been following for 23 years. I'm not sure he knows how bad it's getting, she said. He knows, Walter said. He's not a fool. I know he's not a fool. I'm saying he might not know the part where people are using me to get to him, where my being in his life gives them a lever. Walter set the chisel down again with more deliberateness this time. And if that's true, what does it change? She didn't answer that, because answering it meant deciding something she wasn't ready to say out loud. Whether she was willing to become the reason someone else paid a price. Whether walking away was a form of protection or just a way of giving the cruelest people exactly what they were pushing for. She went home and spent the evening carving a repair commission, a set of tool handles someone needed by the end of the week. And she worked methodically and precisely, and didn't look up from the wood until her hands ached and the lamp had burned down and her father had gone to bed. Gideon came by the following morning unannounced, which was unusual. He knocked at the workshop door, not the house door, which meant he'd thought about where she'd be. She opened it with wood shavings on her coat and a half-finished tool handle in her left hand, and probably not the expression she would have chosen if she'd had warning. I heard about what Reeves' been saying, he said, without preamble. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The workshop was small and smelled of cedar and linseed and the particular quality of sawdust that had been present in a space for years. It was a working room. No decoration, no performance, just the practical evidence of a trade. I figured you had, she said. I want you to know that I didn't refuse Reeve because of anything you said or didn't say. He stood with his hat in his hands, which she noticed was how he carried himself when he was being careful. I refused because the offer was wrong and the man was dishonest, and I've got 16 ranch hands whose work depends on this property staying in operation. I know that. I need you to hear it clearly, though, because the story going around makes it sound like you have influence over my decisions that you don't have. Gideon, she set the tool handle down on the workbench and turned to face him fully. I know what the story is. I've known longer than you have, probably. And I know you didn't refuse Reeve because of me. She paused. That's not what worries me. He looked at her. What worries you? She was quiet for a moment. This was the thing she hadn't said out loud yet, and saying it felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. What worries me is that I'm becoming useful to them, to Reeve, to the widows, to anyone who wants to get at you. I'm an easy target because I don't have money or standing, and people are already inclined to believe the worst. She held his gaze. And if I'm being used as a lever against you, then being around me costs you something. Every week it costs you a little more. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not offended, not dismissive, something more complicated than either. Are you telling me to go? He asked. No? The word came out before she'd fully decided on it, which was its own kind of answer. I'm telling you what I see so you can decide with your eyes open. He set his hat on the corner of the workbench, the gesture of someone settling in rather than leaving. You're the most careful person I've ever met, he said. You treat every conversation like there might be a cost at the end of it. There usually is. Not this one. He looked around the workshop, at the tools hung in their places, at the half-finished pieces on the shelf, at the sawdust patterns on the floor that showed where she stood most often. Then he looked back at her. The syndicate is going to push harder. Reeve isn't done, and whoever's behind him has more patience than he does. It's going to get uglier before anything resolves. He paused. I know that. I need you to know that I know that. She nodded slowly. And I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not from the ranch, and not from here. And if you need to hear a reason beyond the ones I've already given you, then the reason is that the only time the past 4 months have felt like my actual life is when I've been talking to you. He picked his hat back up. So there it is, plain. The workshop was very quiet. Outside, a pair of jays were arguing in the eaves. She let out a slow breath. All right, she said. The word felt different this time than the last time she'd said it. Less cautious, less like a door being held barely open, more like something being acknowledged fully. All right, he said. He left 10 minutes later, and she stood at the workshop window and watched his horse move back up the road toward the ridge, and the valley was muddy and unremarkable in the mid-morning light, and the conversation she'd been half dreading for weeks had turned out to contain something she hadn't expected. Not resolution, not safety, but 2 people looking at the same problem without flinching and deciding to stand on the same side of it. It wasn't nothing. In Red Hollow, in the spring of 1887, with Harwick Valley Development Concern making inroads and the Tully sisters watching through millinery glass, it was about as much as anything could be. The drought came in June without apology. By the second week, the creek that ran along the southern edge of Gideon's property had dropped to a thin, unhappy thread of itself. The grass in the lower pastures went from green to yellow to a pale, brittle brown that crunched underfoot and broke off at the stem when the wind moved through it. The sky sat low and white and gave nothing. No rain, no cloud cover worth mentioning, just heat that pressed down from above and radiated back up from the baked earth and met somewhere in the middle where the air shimmered and made distances hard to judge. Dutch checked the water troughs twice a day and stopped making jokes, which was his particular way of indicating that things were serious. Gideon moved the main herd north to where a secondary spring still ran reliable, consolidated the smaller stock near the barn, and spent most of June evenings walking fence lines with one eye on the sky. He'd seen drought before. What he hadn't seen, in this valley, was drought following a winter this wet. The grass had grown dense and high in spring, and now it was all standing fuel, dried to the core, waiting. He didn't say this to anyone except Dutch, and Dutch already knew it. But the trouble with Reeve didn't stop because of the weather. If anything, it accelerated. In late June, 3 of Cal Mercer's fence posts were found cut, not worn through, not knocked over by stock, but deliberately sawed at the base and then set back in position so they'd look intact until pressure was applied. A section of the Hooper brothers' irrigation ditch had been blocked with packed earth and rock, the kind of blockage that didn't happen naturally. Small acts, each one individually explainable, collectively pointing in one direction. Gideon and Cal sat on Cal's porch one evening and looked at the evidence and didn't say Reeves' name directly for about 10 minutes before Cal finally said it. "We can't prove it," Gideon said. "No. So we can't report it, not with anything that holds." "No." Cal rubbed his face. "The Hoopers are rattled. Emmett Hooper's wife is talking about the offer again. Says maybe the sensible thing is to sell before it gets worse." Gideon looked at the dry hills. "If the Hoopers sell, Prentice follows. Then it's just you and me, and we're not enough to hold the water access." "I know that math too." Cal was quiet a moment. "You think Reeve arranged this? The fence posts? The ditch?" "I think Reeve is the face of something bigger," Gideon said. "And the bigger thing has money and patience and people willing to do small dirty work for payment." "So what do we do?" Gideon didn't answer right away because the honest answer was that he wasn't sure yet, and he didn't want to say something confident that turned out to be wrong. "We document everything, every act of damage, every date, every description, written down and witnessed. And we talk to the Hoopers before their wife talks them into something they can't undo." Cal nodded slowly. "And if it escalates? Then we deal with that when it escalates." It escalated 11 days later. But the fire started sometime after midnight on a Thursday in early July. Gideon woke to Dutch pounding on his bedroom door, not knocking, pounding, with the flat of his fist, the sound of something urgent. He was dressed and outside in under 2 minutes, and he smelled it before he saw it. The thick, acrid smell of burning grass, which was nothing like the clean smell of a hearth fire. It carried heat with it, and distance, and a wrongness that hit the back of the throat. The southeastern pasture was lit from end to end, not a small fire, not a contained burn. The whole south field, 140 acres of dried grass and scrub, moving in the wind that had picked up after sundown, orange and red and a crawling yellow at the edges, throwing light up into the dark sky so that the underside of the smoke column glowed like something internal, like the earth itself had cracked. The wind was from the north, pushing it south and east, which meant it was moving toward the lower properties, toward the Finchland, toward Cal Mercer's south fence, toward the cluster of smaller holdings at the valley's flat end. Gideon stood for about 4 seconds taking in the full picture. Then he started giving orders. "Get everyone up. Full bucket line from the north cistern. Start cutting a fire break at the Sullen Creek tree line. Take the long-handled tools. Don't waste time with the short ones." He turned to the youngest hand, a boy named Pete, who was 17 and standing with his mouth open, staring at the flames. "Pete, ride to every neighboring property south of here, fast as that horse goes. Tell them to get up and get their stock moving north. Don't stop to answer questions." Pete closed his mouth and ran for the stable. What Gideon didn't know, because he was already at the north cistern organizing the bucket line, was that Alora Finch was already awake. She had been awake for an hour before the fire, in fact, sitting at the workshop table because she couldn't sleep, and had found that working on a small piece by lamplight was better than lying in the dark, thinking about the things that had been accumulating since April. She saw the glow first through the north-facing window. Not flames, just the quality of the sky changing, a wrong orange warmth where there should have been black. And she went outside and stood in the yard and felt the wind on her face, and understood in about 10 seconds what was happening and what it meant for everything downhill from Gideon's south pasture. She woke her father. "Stay inside, keep the door wet if the smoke comes." "Alara, I know what I'm doing." She wasn't certain this was true, but she said it like it was. "Don't come out." She took the lantern and went to the old irrigation map. It was her father's, drawn 20 years ago when Walter had helped survey the valley's water system for a property dispute that had since been resolved and forgotten. He kept it rolled in the workshop because he kept everything. It showed the old irrigation trenches, not the current channels, but the older earthwork system from the valley's early settlement, most of it unused now, some of it filled in, but some of it still present under years of grass and runoff. She knew this land. She had grown up on it and walked its edges and spent years noticing things that people with more money and less time noticed only when something went wrong. She knew where the old trenches ran. She knew where the earth was lower and where water would move if pushed. She knew that there were two natural breaks in the terrain, shallow depressions that ran perpendicular to the fire's likely path, that could be used. Could be used if someone organized it correctly, which required people and tools and no small amount of luck with the wind. She rolled the map, put it under her arm, and started toward Gideon's ranch, at a pace that was almost running. What? She arrived to controlled chaos. The bucket line was working, but wasn't going to be enough. She could see that immediately. The fire had too much front, too much fuel behind it. The bucket line would protect the barn and the main structures, but it wasn't going to stop the spread south. Dutch was shouting at two hands who were struggling with a section of water hose that had kinked. Three men were cutting brush at the tree line with axes and couldn't keep pace with the speed of the fire's edge. She found Gideon at the center of it, directing two things at once, his face already dark with smoke. "I know where the old irrigation trenches are," she said, before he could speak. She unrolled the map and held it up in the firelight. "Two of them run nearly perpendicular to the fire's direction here and here," she pointed. "If we widen them and clear the vegetation on the uphill side, we can create breaks the fire can't jump. Not perfectly, but enough to redirect the worst of it away from the lower properties." He looked at the map for 3 seconds. Then he looked at her. She could see him running the calculation, whether she knew what she was talking about, whether there was time, whether the alternative was better. "The East Trench is mostly intact?" he asked. "Mostly. I walked it 2 weeks ago. There's a section near the fence line that's filled in, but it's shallow. 20 minutes of digging." "I don't have 20 minutes." "You have less than that if you don't try this," she said. "The bucket line holds the buildings. This is what saves the South Valley." He turned to Dutch. "Pull 4 men from the bucket line. Give them to her." Then to Alara. "Tell them exactly what to do." She didn't waste time being surprised by it. "I need the 2 longest trenching shovels you have, and the spare water wagon. Not for the fire, for wetting the breaks after they're cleared." Dutch was already moving. The next 3 hours were the worst and most concentrated of Alara Finch's life, and she didn't have a clean way to think about them afterward because they were too full and too loud and too hot, and she was making decisions that she'd never made before with consequences she could feel in real time. The East Trench crew was 4 men plus herself, and the men were good workers who needed clear direction, which she gave them. The trench was deeper than she remembered in the good sections and shallower in others. They cleared vegetation with the long-handled tools, and she moved the water wagon by feel and firelight, wetting the bare earth in a line that the fire would hit and find nothing to take. The wind shifted once, at around 2 in the morning, and her heart dropped completely, because a shift in the wrong direction would render the East Trench useless and push the fire into the Mercer property directly. She stood in the hot wind for about 5 seconds, feeling the direction of it change, and then not settle exactly, but turn enough. Not the worst case. She heard later that Cal Mercer had arrived with 6 of his own hands and started working the second trench from the south end up, which she hadn't known would happen, and which made the difference between enough and not enough. Cal heard about the trench plan from Pete, the young hand who'd ridden the warning circuit, and Cal had made his own decision to trust the plan without ever talking to Alara directly. She thought about that later. A man she'd met twice putting his effort into a strategy she'd drawn up in a dark workshop at midnight from a 20-year-old map. Gideon moved between the bucket line and the trench crews through the whole of it, doing physical work alongside everyone else, not directing from a distance. He got a burn across his right forearm from an ember the size of a playing card that caught him when he was pulling brush. He didn't stop working. Dutch wrapped it with a piece of shirt, and he kept going. At around 4 in the morning, the fire hit the east break and stalled. Not stopped. Stalled, paused, moving along the edge of it laterally and looking for purchase it couldn't find because the ground was wet and bare. The southern push slowed. The second trench was helping. The wind stayed where it was. By 5, the main body of the fire was feeding on what remained of the south pasture rather than advancing. There was still burning. There would be burning for hours yet, but the direction had changed, and the valley south of Gideon's land was not on fire. Alara sat down on a section of bare earth near the east trench at about 5:15 and did not move for several minutes. Her hands were shaking, which she noticed with a kind of distant interest. Her coat was covered in ash, and there was a burn mark on her left sleeve from an ember that had gotten too close. Her throat hurt from smoke and shouting. Dutch brought her water. She drank it without ceremony. Gideon found her 10 minutes later. He came and sat in the dirt beside her, which she would not have expected from a man who owned the land they were sitting on, and he looked at the smoldering south field in the early light and was quiet for a moment. "The South Valley is intact," he said. "Yes." "The Finch property didn't burn." "I know." He was quiet again. Then, "How did you know the trenches would work?" "I didn't," she said. "I thought they would." "Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her. At the ash on her coat, the burn on her sleeve, the way her hands were wrapped around the water cup with the careful steadiness of someone controlling the shake in them. "You organized that entire thing," he said. 4 men, a water wagon, a trench system from a map your father drew 20 years ago. Someone had to. Ilara. His voice was different, quieter, something in it she hadn't heard before. "You saved this valley, not me, not Dutch. You." She looked at the smoldering field. The sky in the east was starting to go from black to the deep charcoal of early dawn, and the smoke column that had been orange and terrible was now just smoke, gray, and dissipating. The damage was real and significant. The south pasture was gone. The fence line was destroyed in 3 sections. It would cost weeks of work to put right, but the houses south of the Hart property were standing. Cal Mercer's barn was standing. Her father's house, she could see its outline in the gray light, intact on the valley floor, was standing. "I knew this land," she said. "That's all." He shook his head slightly, like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. He stayed where he was, sitting in the ash and the early morning cold, shoulder to shoulder with her in the dirt, which said more than most sentences could have. Yet, it was Dutch who found the evidence. He found it while checking the southern fence line at around 8 that morning, after the fire was down, after the work was shifting from fighting to containing. Near the fence post closest to where the fire had clearly started, 2 empty kerosene tins pushed into the brush on the uphill side and covered with loose dirt that the fire's own disturbance had partly uncovered. A length of slow match cord burned down to about a foot from its far end, the rest of it ash. Dutch stood and looked at this for a long time. Then he called for Gideon in a voice that brought Cal Mercer over as well, because there are tones that carry meaning regardless of words, and every man who had been working that field all night recognized the tone. Gideon crouched over the tins without touching them. He looked at the cord. He looked at the way the dirt had been disturbed, not by the fire, or not only by the fire. Someone had been here before the fire started and done what needed doing and left. "Someone started this," Cal said. It wasn't a question. "Someone started this," Gideon said. The 3 of them stood in the early morning with the burned smell heavy in the air and the valley saved behind them, and the evidence of who had put it in danger right there in the dirt, and the name no one said out loud yet settled over the scene like the remaining smoke, present, undeniable, waiting for someone to find the courage to speak it clearly. Gideon straightened up. His burned arm hurt, and he hadn't slept, and his south pasture was destroyed, and somewhere between 4 o'clock and now something in him had finished being patient. "Don't touch it," he said. "I want witnesses to see it where it is." He turned back toward the ranch. There was still work to do. And then, after the work, there would be something else entirely. The kerosene tins sat in the dirt for 2 hours while Gideon sent Pete into town to fetch the county deputy. Deputy Marshal Cord Yates arrived at 10:30 on a horse that looked unhappy about the pace it had been pushed. Yates was a practical man in his mid-40s who had held the county appointment for 11 years and had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough dishonesty to be unsurprised by it, but not so much that he'd stopped caring. He looked at the tins. He looked at the cord. He looked at the disturbed dirt around the fence post and crouched there for a long time without speaking. "Slow match," he said finally. "Yes," Gideon said. "Set from outside the fence line, which means someone who wasn't on your property. Someone who knew the fence line." Yates stood up and looked at the burned field, at the scope of the damage, the blackened acre after acre of what had been decent grazing land 12 hours ago. You have ideas about who? It wasn't quite a question. Gideon had sent for the deputy, and Yates was a man who understood that people didn't send for law enforcement unless they already had a direction in mind. Aldous Reeve, voici, Gideon said. Harwick Valley Development Concern. He made an offer on this property in April. I declined. He's made offers on most of the valley, and the holdouts have been dealing with fence damage, blocked irrigation, and now this. Yates looked at him steadily. That's a serious accusation. I know what it is. I'm telling you who I think is responsible so you know where to start looking. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Cal Mercer was standing 10 feet away and nodded when Yates glanced at him. Same man approached me, Cal said. And the Hooper brothers. We've had damage too. Documented. You documented it. Yates sounded mildly surprised. Written down? Witnessed? Dated, Gideon said. Going back to May. Yates looked between them. Then he pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. All right, he said. Tell me everything. From the beginning. The thing about evidence is that it rarely arrives as a complete picture. What Yates found over the following 4 days was not a confession and not a clean chain of custody pointing directly at Reeve. What he found was a collection of threads, frayed at the edges, some of them circumstantial, some of them stronger, that when pulled in the same direction began to indicate the same shape. One of the men who had been seen in the valley by multiple witnesses in the weeks before the fire was traced to a boarding house in the next county. He had left 2 days before the fire, which was notable timing, and his landlady remembered that 2 men had come asking for him the week before. Well-dressed men, not from the area. She had seen one of them pass him an envelope. A hardware merchant in Harwick County, when questioned about slow-match cord purchases, produced a ledger entry for a significant quantity sold to a buyer who had paid cash and given a name that matched no one in the county records. The merchant remembered the buyer's face well enough to describe him. Medium build, city clothes, a ring on his right hand with a flat blue stone. Reeve's business associate, a man named Fitch, who handled the concern's local operations, wore a ring with a flat blue stone. 3 people confirmed this independently: Dutch, who had seen Fitch at the ranch during Reeve's initial visit, and 2 merchants in town who had dealt with him since. None of it was enough to bring charges on its own. Yates was honest about that when he sat down with Gideon and Cal on the 4th day. What I have is a pattern that points somewhere, he said. What I don't have is something a judge can hold in his hand. What would a judge need to hold in his hand? Gideon asked. Financial connection between Reeve's concern and whoever set that fire, or a witness willing to say directly who hired them and why. Yates closed his notebook. The first is possible if someone with standing requests a review of the concern's accounts. That requires a formal complaint and some patience. The second is harder, Mom. People who take money for dirty work don't generally volunteer to explain themselves. Unless the alternative is worse than explaining, Cal said. Yates looked at him without expression. I'd ask you not to pursue that direction independently. I'm speaking theoretically. I'd ask you not to do that either. Alara was not part of those conversations. She was home, repairing damage to her father's property that the near miss with the fire had caused. The heat had warped 2 sections of the workshop wall facing north, and the smoke had gotten into everything, and there was cleaning and airing and fixing that fell to her because her father's leg was having one of its worst weeks, and he couldn't manage the ladder work. She heard the report of what Yates had found the same way she heard most things, secondhand from Ruth Halloway, who was not a gossip in the malicious sense, but who moved through information the way water moved through a town, finding every low channel. They're saying it was Reeve's man, Ruth told her, outside the post office on a Wednesday. The ring matches Fitch. Deputy Yates has been to Harwick County twice. But no charges yet, Alara said. Not yet. Alara thought about this on the walk home. She thought about Reeve and Fitch and the kerosene tins and the particular kind of violence that was dressed up as business. The impersonal destruction of things people had built with their hands in their years, reduced to leverage in a transaction. She thought about the 7 families who had already sold, who were gone from the valley now, or soon would be, who had stood in front of a man like Reeve with their damaged fences and their blocked irrigation and their medical bills, and done the arithmetic and come up short. She thought about Harlan Briggs, the banker, who had advised 4 of those families to sell. She was at the workshop table that evening when the thought arrived fully formed, the way important thoughts sometimes did. Not built up piece by piece, but present all at once, complete. Briggs had advised the families. Briggs had access to their financial records. Briggs would have known exactly which families were most vulnerable to pressure, which ones were close enough to the edge that a bad season or a damaged fence would push them over. If someone needed to identify the weakest points in the valley's resistance, a banker was precisely the person to ask. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and went to find her father's property survey and the old letters he kept from the valley's early settlement days, and she started reading with the specific attention of someone looking for something they couldn't yet name. She found it in a letter dated 1881, a dispute between two early valley landholders about water rights, in which a surveyor had noted the precise boundaries of the original settlement grant. The grant included a clause, buried in the third paragraph, that restricted the transfer of water access rights to any entity that did not maintain active agricultural operations on the land. If the concern bought the valley's properties and consolidated them into a single commercial operation rather than maintaining individual agricultural use, the water rights clause could be challenged. The entire consolidation depended on those water rights being transferable. Without them, the Eastern Pass access that made the operation profitable became legally complicated at minimum and potentially void. She read the clause 4 times. She was not a lawyer. She was a woodcarver who had grown up reading her father's survey documents because there was nothing else to read in the workshop, and she had been a curious child. She didn't know if the clause held legal weight in the current territory statutes. She didn't know if it had been superseded by later legislation, but she knew someone needed to find out. And she knew Gideon had not seen this letter because it had been in her father's collection, not his. She brought it to Gideon the following morning. He was at the fence line, supervising the repair work on the south pasture boundary. There were 4 men working it, digging new post holes in the burned ground, and the progress was visible and real in the way physical work always was. He saw her coming across the field and met her at the edge of the work area, reading her expression. "What is it?" he said. Not a question exactly. She handed him the letter without preamble. "Read the 3rd paragraph, the water rights clause." He read it. He read it again more slowly. She watched his face as the meaning settled in, the slight shift in his jaw, the stillness that came over him when he was thinking hard. "This is from your father's collection," he said, "from a property dispute in 1881, the original grant language. If this is still active, if it is, the concern's consolidation plan doesn't work the way they've structured it. They need agricultural use maintained on each parcel for the water rights to transfer. One large commercial operation doesn't qualify." He looked at her. "You found this last night." "I had a thought about Briggs, and I went looking. This wasn't what I was looking for, but it was there." "What were you looking for?" She paused. "Something that connected Briggs to Reeve directly. I haven't found that yet. But this—" She nodded at the letter in his hands. "This is something a lawyer needs to see." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up and called across the field. "Dutch, come here." Dutch came over and Gideon handed him the letter. Dutch read it with the careful slowness of a man who was not a fast reader but was a thorough one. When he looked up, his expression was the closest thing to satisfaction Alara had seen on his face since the fire. "There a lawyer in the county who isn't connected to Harwick money?" Dutch asked. "Possibly one," Gideon said. "Tom Aldridge over in Crest Falls. I used him for the original property purchase. He's not local and he doesn't owe favors to anyone in this valley. How soon can you get to him?" "Today, if I leave now." Dutch looked at Alara with something that had a quality she wasn't used to receiving from people in Red Hollow. Not quite respect exactly, but the precursor of it. The look of someone recalibrating. "Good find," he said. She nodded once. She didn't make anything of it. Gideon rode to Crest Falls and back in a single long day, and when he returned it was past 8 in the evening and he was dirty and tired, and he came to the Finch property before going home, which told her it was important. Tom Aldridge's assessment, delivered in the practical language of a man who dealt in precision. The water rights clause was in the original territorial grant and had not been superseded by any subsequent legislation he could find in the county records. It was, in his professional opinion, likely enforceable. A challenge based on it would require a filing with the Territorial Land Office and would take time, but the concern's consolidation structure almost certainly violated it. Aldridge had agreed to take the case. Alara stood in the doorway of the workshop and listened to this and felt something shift. Not triumph, because the thing wasn't over and she wasn't built for premature triumph, but a change in the weight of it, like a load being distributed differently across her shoulders. "That's good news," she said. "It's a start," Gideon said. He was leaning against the porch post, his hat in his hands, the tiredness on him visible. Aldridge also said something else. He paused. He said that if we could produce evidence of coordinated financial pressure, a pattern of damage timed to concern activity, combined with banking advice that steered vulnerable landowners toward the sale, that's a separate legal matter. Potentially a serious one. "Briggs," she said. He looked at her. "You went looking for something last night. What made you think of Briggs?" She leaned against the opposite doorpost. Because the families that sold, they weren't the ones with the most damage. Some of them had minimal property damage. They sold because they were financially cornered. Someone who knew their account status would know exactly which families were close enough to the edge that a small push would work. She paused. Briggs didn't just advise them to sell, he recommended it at specific moments. Not before the concern arrived, not months later, but within days of first contact. That's not coincidence, and it's not good banking practice. Gideon was quiet. "Can we prove the timing?" "The families that sold are still in the territory. 3 of them are in Red Hollow. If they're willing to say when Briggs spoke to them and what he said..." She stopped. "That's if they're willing. After what Reeves' people did to this valley, some of them might be." She nodded slowly. "It's worth asking." He stayed for another half hour. Her father joined them at some point, sitting in his workshop chair with a cup of coffee and the quiet contentment of a man who was watching something he had hoped for come slowly together. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The next 10 days moved the way consequential things sometimes moved. Not dramatically, not in a single clean reveal, but in accumulation. 2 of the families who had sold agreed to speak to Deputy Yates on record about the timing of Briggs's recommendations. One of them, a man named Aldous Kearney, who had sold his property in May and was now living with his brother's family while he figured out what came next, was particularly clear. Briggs had approached him the day after Reeves' initial visit. Not the week after. The day after. He had known Reeves was coming, which meant the 2 men were in communication before the concern ever made its public offer. Yates filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office and sent a written summary of evidence to the county circuit judge. He did this on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Aldous Reeves had been informed and left his hotel in Harwick County for parts east. Fitch followed within hours. The departure was not an admission. Yates was careful to say that. Flight was not guilt, legally speaking, and the process would take months and might not produce convictions. But it changed the atmosphere in a way that was immediate and visible. The men working for the concern's local operations stopped showing up. The pressure on the remaining holdouts, Gideon, Cal, the Hooper brothers, went quiet. Harlan Briggs did not leave. He couldn't easily leave. He had a bank to run and a reputation to defend, and he was not the kind of man who ran. What he did instead was sit very still and wait, which was its own form of answer. The conversation about Briggs, about what he had done, and what it had cost the valley's most vulnerable families, moved through Red Hollow in the particular way that conversations move through small towns when they contained information people had already half suspected. It did not need to be stated dramatically. It simply became known in the way things became known, passed from one person to the next, considered, confirmed by the separate threads of individual experience, until the aggregate understanding of who Harlan Briggs was and what he had done settled over the town like weather. Gideon walked past the bank on a Tuesday and did not go in, which 10 people saw. Cal Mercer moved his family's account to a bank in the next county. The Hooper brothers followed. Briggs watched it happen and sat still and said nothing, and his silence was the last and most complete piece of evidence in a case that had never needed a courtroom to reach its verdict. It was Ruth Halloway who said it first, aloud, in a place where people could hear it. She set it at the market on a Saturday in early August, standing near the stall where Alara was selling her carved pieces. She had a new set, small and detailed, the kind of work she'd had less time for during the worst of it, and was returning to now. Ruth stood beside her and said to no one in particular and to everyone within range, "You know, most of our houses in the South Valley are standing because of what this woman did." Nobody disputed it. Clara Tully, who was at the neighboring stall buying ribbon, did not agree out loud. But she did not disagree either, and for Clara Tully that was a significant position to hold. Alara kept her eyes on her work and did not make anything of it, because making something of it felt like precisely the wrong move. But she felt it. The slight shift in the air around her, the way the market continued its noise and motion, but with something different in the quality of how people moved past her stall. Not celebration, not apology exactly, just a town revising its understanding, one person at a time, slowly and imperfectly, the way towns did. She sold 5 pieces that morning and took the money home to her father and sat in the workshop and didn't say anything about any of it. And Walter looked at her once and went back to his carving because he had always known this was where they were going, and he was patient enough to let the world arrive at conclusions his daughter had earned without requiring anyone to make a speech about it. The Territorial Land Office ruling came in September, on a Thursday, in the form of a 2-page document delivered by postwriter to Tom Aldridge in Cress Falls, who sent a copy to Gideon by the same afternoon's writer. The water rights clause held. Aldridge's letter accompanying the ruling was characteristically brief. The original grant language is enforceable as written. The concern's consolidation structure violates the agricultural use requirement on 14 of the 17 acquired parcels. Transfer of water access rights on those parcels is void. I will file the formal notice with the county recorder next week. Recommend you inform your neighbors. Gideon read it twice at the kitchen table with Dutch standing across from him, and then set it down flat on the wood and sat with it for a moment. Not triumph. He didn't feel triumph exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than that. The ruling meant the concern's valley operation was legally dead. It meant the 7 families who had sold under pressure had a basis for challenging those sales, or at minimum for renegotiating terms that had been built on false premises. It meant that Reeve and Fitch, wherever they had gone, had run from something that was now on paper and in the record and couldn't be undone by their absence. It also meant that none of the months since April could be given back. The burned south pasture was still burned. The families that had still sold, and some of them had already made other arrangements and rebuilt elsewhere and weren't coming back. The damage was real, and the ruling didn't erase it. "Good news," Dutch said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Go tell Cal Mercer. And the Hoopers." Dutch picked up his hat. "You going to tell Alara?" Gideon looked at the letter on the table. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to tell Alara." He rode to the Finch property in the mid-afternoon and found her where he usually found her when the weather was decent, outside the workshop, working on a piece in the natural light, because the interior lamp was adequate but never quite the same. She was doing detail work on what looked like a hawk, mid-wing, the feather lines laid in with the small curved chisel she used for fine cuts. She looked up when she heard the horse and read his expression before he said a word, the way she had gotten good at reading him over these months. "The ruling came," she said. "Clause holds. The concern's water rights transfers are void." He dismounted and tied the horse. "Aldridge files the formal notice next week." She set the hawk down on the workbench beside her and wiped the chisel on her work cloth. She didn't say anything for a moment. He had learned to let her silences be what they were. Not absence of feeling, but the presence of it being processed. "The families that sold," she said finally, "do they have recourse?" Aldridge thinks some of them might. Depends on the individual sale terms and how much they want to pursue it. He's willing to look at each case. Gideon leaned against the fence post. "It won't be clean. Some of them took the money and spent it on debts that are now paid. Unwinding that is complicated. But some of them might get their land back." "Some of them might?" She nodded slowly. The hawk sat between them on the workbench, half-finished, wings spread and frozen mid-motion. She picked it up again, not to work on it, just to hold it, a thing her hands did when she was thinking. "Briggs," she said, Yates has referred the matter to the circuit court. Whether it goes to a formal hearing depends on how many of the families are willing to give sworn testimony. He paused. 3 have already agreed. That might be enough. And Reeve and Fitch, gone east. Aldridge says the land office ruling makes any further concern activity in this territory commercially pointless. They're not coming back for a fight that's already lost. He looked at her. It's not a perfect resolution. I want to be clear about that. Reeve probably walks away from this with his money intact, living somewhere he's never heard of Red Hollow. That's the part that doesn't sit right. She looked at the hawk. No, she said, but the valley is here. The land is here. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It's not nothing. What happened in Red Hollow in the weeks following the ruling was not a dramatic reversal. Towns didn't work that way, and people who expected them to ended up disappointed. What happened instead was the slow, somewhat awkward process of a community adjusting to information it had been given about itself, about who it had trusted, about who it had dismissed, about the gap between those two things. Harlan Briggs resigned from the bank in late September, citing personal reasons, which was the kind of statement that said everything by saying nothing. The bank's board appointed an interim manager from outside the county, a practical decision made by people who understood that the institution needed visible distance from what Briggs had done. The families who had been advised to sell began quiet conversations with Aldridge about their options. None of this happened loudly. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic scenes in the middle of Main Street. The accounting was done in offices and across kitchen tables, and in the particular private arithmetic of people who had been wronged, trying to figure out what could be recovered and what had to be accepted as simply gone. What was public, and impossible to ignore, was the shift in how the town moved around Elara Finch. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't complete, and it wasn't, if she was being honest with herself, entirely comfortable. The women who had spent months treating her as a cautionary figure now found reasons to speak to her at the market, to comment on her work, to ask questions that were genuine or close enough to genuine that the difference didn't matter practically. The Tully sisters, those dedicated archivists of Red Hollow's social record, made a point of stopping at her stall 2 Saturdays in a row and examining her pieces with the studious attention of people publicly revising their position. She accepted all of it without warmth and without coldness. She was not a person who performed graciousness she didn't feel, but she also understood that extended resentment was a weight that cost the person carrying it more than the people it was aimed at. She had work to do and a father to care for and a life in this valley that was, by any measure, better than it had been a year ago. She didn't need anyone's approval to confirm that. What she did need, what she found herself thinking about in the workshop in the evenings, was harder to name and easier to avoid naming. Gideon came by on a Sunday in early October when the valley was starting to go gold and the heat had finally broken, and the air had that particular quality of late frontier autumn, clean and cool and carrying the smell of turned earth and dry grass and something else that wasn't quite wood smoke but was adjacent to it. He didn't come with a purpose, which was how she knew the purpose was something real. He sat on the workshop step while she worked, and they talked about the south pasture restoration. He was reseeding it in sections, a multi-year process. The burned ground slow to recover. He talked about the cooperative arrangement with Cal and the Hoopers, which was working better than he'd expected, the shared equipment reducing the individual cost burden for all 3 operations through the drought's aftermath. She talked about a commission she'd received. A furniture maker in Harwick County had seen her carved pieces and wanted to discuss a working arrangement, larger pieces, better pay, which was the kind of professional shift she'd been working toward for 2 years without quite seeing a path to it. They talked about Walter, whose leg had stabilized into a condition that was permanent limitation rather than active deterioration, which was the better version of the available futures. They talked around the thing that was actually present in the conversation for about 40 minutes, and then Gideon set his coffee cup down on the step and looked at the valley going gold in the late afternoon light and said, I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to hear the whole thing before you respond. She set the chisel down. All right. He turned to face her, which was the gesture of a man who had decided to stop looking at the middle distance and deal with what was actually in front of him. I've been thinking about what this place is, what the ranch is, what I'm doing with it. The cooperative idea with Cal, it works, and it works because the valley is stronger as connected operations than as competing ones. I want to build that out, properly. A formal arrangement that gives smaller operations access to shared resources, equipment, water management, market access, in exchange for cooperation on the larger things. He paused. It's not a new idea, but this valley needs someone to run it who knows how people work and how the land works and isn't afraid of either. Someone who people will actually listen to because they've already seen what she can do under the worst conditions. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to run a land cooperative. I'm asking you to help build one and then run it. Yes, paid work, real authority. Not a favor I'm doing you. The valley needs this, and you're the person who should do it. She was quiet for a moment. That's a professional proposal. It's also something else, he said, and I want to be clear about that too. The job stands regardless of the something else. I'm not offering one as a way of getting to the other. They're separate, and you can have one without the other, and I'll respect that entirely. He stopped. But the something else is real, and I think you know it's real, and I've been not saying it plainly for about 8 months, and I'm tired of not saying it plainly. The workshop was quiet. Outside, one of the Finch property's 3 hens was announcing something to the yard with the confidence of an animal that expected an audience. Elara looked at him for a long moment. There were things she'd been carrying for 8 months too. The careful distance she'd maintained, the constant measurement of what was appropriate and what was too much, and what it would mean for him and for her father and for the version of herself that had learned not to expect too much. The vigilance of someone who had been on the wrong end of a community's judgment long enough to internalize it as caution. She thought about the blizzard, the knock on the door, the stranger on her step talking about a buried woodpile like it was the most practical thing in the world. She thought about the workshop and the carved horse and all the Saturday conversations that had added up to something neither of them had planned for. The job, she said. I want it understood that the job is mine because I can do it, not because of anything else. Understood. Agreed. And the something else, she paused. She was not a person who spoke carelessly, and she wasn't going to start. The something else is real for me too. Has been for a while. I've just been... She looked at the half-finished hawk on the bench. Careful. I know you've been careful. His voice was quiet. You've been careful because careful kept you safe, and I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to consider that careful and open aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something honest to his face, showing the tired lines around his eyes, the burn scar on his forearm that had healed crooked, the way he held himself when he wasn't performing anything. Just a man on a workshop step, asking a plain question, waiting for a plain answer. All right, she said. The word had a different weight each time she said it to him. This version was the heaviest and the most settled. He nodded once, slowly. He didn't make it into a scene, which she respected. He picked his coffee back up, and she picked the chisel back up, and they sat in the October afternoon, and the valley went about its quiet business around them. The Red Hollow Valley Cooperative, as it came to be called, was formally registered with the Territorial Land Office in November of 1887. It had 7 founding member operations: Gideon's Ranch, Cal Mercer's Spread, the Hooper brothers, Elias Prentice, who had come back to the table after the ruling made his sale legally challengeable, and 2 smaller farms that had watched the summer's events from the edges and decided that the cooperative model was worth the commitment. Elara ran it from a single room in the building adjacent to the Red Hollow Assay Office, which Gideon leased on behalf of the cooperative, and she furnished with her father's spare workbench and 2 chairs and a filing system that started organized and stayed that way because she was that kind of person. The work was not glamorous. It was scheduling and negotiation and the management of shared resources across 7 operations that each had their own priorities and their own opinions about how things should be done. It was disputes about equipment rotation and arguments about water allocation in dry months, and the ongoing challenge of getting independent-minded ranchers to see their individual interests as connected to the collective one. She was good at it. Not because she was patient exactly, she wasn't particularly, but because she was direct without being cruel, and she understood the land practically rather than theoretically. And when someone came to her with a complaint, she dealt with the actual problem rather than the version of the problem that was easier to address. Dutch told Gideon 3 months in that the Hooper brothers had told Cal Mercer that the cooperative was the best business decision they'd made in 10 years. Dutch said this in a tone that suggested he was reporting it as news, though his expression suggested he had already known it was true. The circuit court hearing regarding Harlan Briggs took place in December in the county seat before a judge who had read the full file that Yates had assembled and had the particular expression of a man working hard to maintain judicial neutrality while reading something that made him angry. Briggs testified on his own behalf with the careful language of a man who had hired competent legal representation and rehearsed his answers thoroughly. 3 of the families who had sold testified about the timing of his recommendations and the specific financial information he had referenced, information they had never directly shared with Reeves' operation, information that could only have come from their banking records. The judge did not rule from the bench. He took the matter under advisement, and the ruling came in February. Not criminal charges, because the evidentiary standard for those hadn't been met, but a civil finding of breach of fiduciary duty with damages assessed against Briggs personally. It was enough to end whatever remained of his professional reputation in the territory. He left Red Hollow by spring and did not come back. Yates sent a written summary of the Reeve and Fitch matter to 3 other territorial jurisdictions, flagging the operational pattern for law enforcement colleagues in areas where the Harwick Valley Development Concern had previously operated. Whether anything came of those inquiries, Gideon never learned for certain. He suspected not. Men like Reeve had a talent for moving far enough that the damage they left behind never quite caught up with them. That was the imperfect part, the part that didn't resolve cleanly, the part that required a person to sit with the fact that justice, in the real world on real ground, was partial. It reached as far as it reached, and then it stopped. And beyond that stopping point was just the ongoing work of building something that couldn't be so easily dismantled again. Gideon thought about this on the evening the Briggs ruling came through, sitting on his porch in the February cold with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He wasn't angry. He had been angry for a long time. Through the summer, through the fire, through the months of documentation and testimony and waiting, and at some point the anger had burned down to something more sustainable. Not acceptance of what was wrong, but the recognition that you couldn't carry a fire indefinitely without burning yourself. You worked with what the ruling gave you. You rebuilt what the fire took. You kept the land and the people on it, and you made it harder next time for someone to walk in with a surveyor's map and a lawyer's smile and treat your neighbors like line items in a ledger. Walter Finch died in March, on a quiet Tuesday in his bed, with Alara beside him. It was not unexpected. His health had been declining since the previous autumn in the small incremental ways that announced themselves gradually. Less appetite, more sleep, the leg giving him new trouble that had nothing to do with the leg. He had known, and she had known, and they had not talked about it directly because that was not how either of them handled the things that mattered most. What they had done instead was work together, side by side in the workshop, through the fall and winter, him on smaller pieces that his hands could still manage, her on the larger commissions, both of them quiet in the particular way of people who have spent enough years together that silence is not absence. He told her 3 things in the last week, in the plain-spoken way he told everything, that she had made him proud, not by being remarkable but by being honest, that the cooperative was good work and she should keep at it, and that the man who came to their door in a blizzard with a load of firewood had turned out to be worth the trust she'd given him, which Walter said he had suspected from fairly early on. She held his hand and didn't say much because there wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said over the course of a life lived in the same small rooms, and Walter Finch died as he had lived, without drama or complaint, with the particular dignity of someone who had made things with his hands and taught his daughter to do the same. Gideon came the morning after and helped with the arrangements and did not say things that weren't true or useful, which was what she needed. He stayed for most of the day. Dutch came by in the afternoon with food from the ranch kitchen, as did Cal Mercer's wife, as did Ruth Halloway, as did, in a moment that was not lost on Alara, Clara Tully, who brought a covered dish and said nothing except that she was sorry for the loss, and Alara thanked her and meant it. The valley showed up, imperfectly and a little late, the way valleys did. Spring came the way it always came to Red Hollow. Suddenly, after weeks of ambiguity, the cold breaking and the creek rising and the south pasture showing the first thin green of new grass growing back through the burned soil. The recovery of burned land was always slower than people wanted and faster than they feared. By April, there was color in the south field. Not restored, not what it had been, but alive again. Alara moved her wood carving operation into the cooperative's office building, occupying a second room that they hadn't been using, which made practical sense and also meant she was there most mornings when Gideon came by for the cooperative's weekly planning discussion. This was on the surface an administrative arrangement. It was not only an administrative arrangement. They had been careful with each other through the winter. Grief did that, the way it asked for space and quiet and the suspension of momentum. Gideon had given her the space without being asked, which she noticed and didn't comment on and was grateful for. When she came back incrementally, the way she did most things. One conversation at a time, one morning at a time, building toward something without announcing she was building it. One Wednesday in April, after the planning meeting had finished and the two other cooperative members had left, she was standing at the window looking at the main street of Red Hollow in the spring light. The mud, the horses, the merchants moving their morning stock, and she said without turning around, "I've been thinking about what this place is, what it means to belong somewhere." Gideon was still at the table, reviewing the season's equipment schedule. "What do you think it means?" She turned around. "I think it's not about being accepted. I spent a long time wanting that, and I've stopped wanting it mostly." She paused. "I think it's about having work that matters and people you've chosen and a piece of ground you know by heart." She looked at him. "I have all three of those now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down the schedule. "Alara," he said, "marry me." It was not a speech. It was not decorated. It was 4 words from a man who had learned, slowly and not without difficulty, that the plainest version of the truth was also the most accurate one. She considered him, the tiredness he still carried from a hard year, the burn scar on his arm, the man who had knocked on a stranger's door in a blizzard with a load of firewood, and no particular explanation except that it was a bad storm, the man who had sat in the dirt beside her at 5 a.m. in a burned field and stayed. "Yes," she said. It was the smallest and most complete answer she had given in her life. The wedding was small, in May, in front of the cooperative office because Alara said she preferred it outdoors and Gideon said he preferred whatever she preferred. Cal Mercer and his wife attended. Dutch stood near the door with the expression of a man who was moved and was managing it with great dignity. The Hooper brothers came. Ruth Halloway cried, which was not surprising. Even the Tully sisters came, standing at a respectful distance with the quiet presence of people who understood they were witnesses to something they had once tried to prevent, and had the grace, finally, to be glad they hadn't succeeded. There was no grand speech. There was no dramatic declaration in front of the assembled town. It was just 2 people in the May morning making a decision in front of the people who had watched them reach it. What Alara thought, standing in the spring light with the valley spread behind her and the smell of new grass on the air and the carved wooden horse, which had sat on Gideon's desk for a year and a half, and now sat on the window ledge of the cooperative office where she could see it every morning, somewhere in her peripheral vision, that the things that lasted were not the things that arrived complete. They were the things that got built piece by piece, in the dark and the cold and the difficulty, by people who kept showing up when it would have been easier not to. That was what love was, she thought, not the absence of cost, not the guarantee of easy, just 2 people deciding the other one was worth the weather. Red Hollow was not a perfect town. It had done unkind things and believed convenient lies and let powerful men operate in its midst for too long before demanding an accounting. It carried those marks the way old wood carried its grain, visible, permanent, part of the structure. But it had also sent people with food when a man died and a woman grieved. It had sent hands into a fire in the middle of the night. It had revised itself, slowly and imperfectly, toward something more honest than what it had been. That was what towns were, Alara thought. Not the best version of themselves. Just the ongoing attempt at it, one season at a time, one decision at a time, with all the imperfect people inside them doing what they could with what they had. She could work with that. She had been working with that her whole life.